Welcome to Believe It or Not, an Interfaith Grand River program. I'm your host, August Edelman, and I'm joined today by Hansen, who is actually the producer of our show. Thanks so much for being on the program.
Usually I'm behind the cameras, and that's why I've got this thing in my hand so I can control them and see you wherever you are.
So let's talk a bit about why you wanted to do this program.
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that I'm just really curious, and I find it really interesting just to listen to people talking about what's important to them and to hear some of what brought them to that spot. But I also find that in the world where we are today and the way people are acting towards each other, a lot of people, it really breaks my heart.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who are being hurt right now. And so many times you wonder, what the heck can I do? This is a problem that's so big.
Yeah.
And this is what I can do.
Yeah.
Because I know that there are some people who seem really frightening because we don't know much about them. And it turns out they're a grandpa and they just happen to live up the street. Mm-hmm. And if you can meet them as the grandpa who just happens to live up the street, instead of that frightening person I don't understand, there's less reason to fear them. Mm-hmm. And the more we get to know people, the less fearsome they become.
Beautifully put. Absolutely beautifully put. So let's talk a little bit about you. So we are currently filming inside your church, which is a Lutheran church. Tell me a bit about that. Did you grow up Lutheran?
I started out Lutheran and was told all the stories, believed all the stories that they were exactly as they were told. Mm-hmm. And then I went off to university and I've discovered that not everything was exactly the way it was written down in the stories. Mm-hmm. And that rocked my world. And it took me a while to figure out that the importance in the story isn't so much the history of the story, but why was that story kept? Because there could have been so many stories. Mm-hmm. Why that story in particular? What message does that story have for me today? Because there are so many things I could know about the past. Why is it that that particular message needed to come to me now? Mm-hmm. And when I look at the stories in that way, they have so much more meaning. So, in my high school and university days, I drifted a bit away from my faith. And then after some contemplation, I started coming back and thinking, yeah, I do want to have that relationship with God. And it just so happens that Lutheranism is the way that I know. Mm-hmm. It could have been anything, yeah, but that's the one that I chose simply because it was familiar. And it meant something to me. And then over time, as I got to know it better, I realized it really speaks to me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it is what I believe. It's not just what's familiar.
Yeah. Interesting. I like that. That's a good line. That's a good line. Not just what's familiar. So I sort of jumped ahead a bit, so I'm going to step back and ask a little bit about who you are when you're not inside this room. So you're our producer, but you're so many other things as well. So tell us a bit about that.
I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up. And that the answer to that changes every so often. I have spent the last 25, 30 years as a teacher. And the reason that I got into that is kind of the same reason I'm doing these, is because I want to change the world. Mm-hmm. And as a teacher, you can do that one kid at a time. And then opportunities arose, and I became a vice principal, and I did that for a couple of decades. And as a teacher, you've got your group of 25, 30 kids that you're really working with intensely. As a vice principal, you're working with 500 to 1,000 kids. And each one of those has 2 or 3 other people in their immediate family that are really important to them, and you're working with them as well. Mm-hmm. And in that group of people, in those thousands of people, there's somebody who's in jail. Yeah. There's somebody who has hit somebody else recently. There are several people, kids and adults, who when they get angry, their only coping mechanism is to scream. Yeah. And sometimes they're screaming at me or kicking me. Mm-hmm. And you have to care about all these people. If you're going to do the job right, if you're going to make a difference, you have to care.
Yeah.
And after doing that, with that many people, with that many intense needs, I found I couldn't anymore. I just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So I had to retire early because of the damage that caring that much for people with that many needs does to you.
Yeah.
So that happened a year ago, and I'm slowly trying to figure out my way to what comes next. And I'm picking out different projects and trying to explore what's the next way that I can make the world a better place.
That's really interesting. I come from a family of teachers, and so I'm familiar a bit with that, the kind of burnout that comes with, caring and wanting to make things better. And that the magnitude of so much need, and so many different kinds of needs that you may or may not feel like you're particularly equipped to handle, I'm sure. That's pretty extraordinary work.
And there are some times when it becomes really frustrating because you can see what needs to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and you know you don't have the resources to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talked a bit about coming back to Lutheranism and realizing, it's not just that it's familiar, it's that you belong here. So what are some of the kind of main ideas in your faith tradition that you kind of hold close to your heart that are really important for you day to day?
One of the things that bothered me and why I started drifting a little bit from the faith was I've been told over and over and over again that God is love. But then when I look at history, I know that there were times, say before Lutheranism or Christianity came along, when people just didn't have a chance to believe in that way or to act in that way because it hadn't been created yet. Or there were times when that particular branch of the faith hadn't reached that part of the world yet. Mm-hmm. And if that is the right way, I didn't understand how a God of love could abandon so many people in different places and in different times. That just didn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense to me to believe in God if God is not love. Mm-hmm. If God is angry or indifferent, then there's no reason to believe in God. Mm-hmm. So God has to be love. And if God is love, then I can't see any way that there is one true way of speaking to God or approaching God. That just doesn't make sense to me. And then the more that I looked into what the Lutheran Church says, I began to appreciate the emphasis that there is on grace. And that's the idea that you don't earn your way into God's favor. You're already there. So there is no hoops you have to jump through. There are no check boxes you have to do. God already loves you. So the question isn't, what are you going to do to earn God's love? The question is, how are you going to respond to God's love?
Interesting.
And that takes a whole lot of thinking. And I've had people say, well, if there's no enforcement mechanism, why don't you just sit on your couch eating chips all day and not worry about anybody at all? Mm-hmm. But then you come back to the question of, you can, and God loves you, and God will maybe be sad, but God's not going to do anything about it. But what's your life going to be like? Mm-hmm. And how are you going to feel about yourself? And when you are given that much love, it kind of makes you wonder, what can I do to make the world a loving place as well?
Absolutely. And, there's so many different ways that we can express love to each other and to ourselves and out in the world. And so much of what you've talked about already and that you talk about all the time, knowing you through IGR, is that doing good in the world is taking that love and doing something with it.
But we're not told that we have to.
Right. Yeah.
And that just takes such a load off of my shoulders. Mm-hmm. Because I don't have to do anything. I can look around to figure out what is it that makes sense to me and that speaks to me. I've got the time to sit back and contemplate. I don't have to jump into action and say, okay, tell me what to do because I'm going to do it now.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I like that approach. And I think you're very good at sort of practicing what you preach in that term.
Thank you.
You know. So you're involved in IGR. I know you're very involved at your church as well. Tell me a bit about how your faith impacts your life and how you impact your faith.
One thing that I'm very aware of is that I'm not alone.
Mm.
And that helps me in a few different ways. One is that, like, there have been some times that have been really challenging. I've been so stressed out. And just getting up in the morning was really hard.
Yeah.
And there are so many people that I'm trying to support, and I'm carrying so much. And then I remember I don't have to carry it on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some days where I've woken up, and before I've opened my eyes, I've paused in prayer, because that gives me a chance to say, this one I can't carry. I need you to carry that for me. And knowing that I'm never alone, that I always have someone to help me carry what I'm carrying, makes it possible for me to carry it. It makes it possible for me to do more.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got that personal relationship, and in that way I'm not alone. I also have this community that meets in this building. And I hear about the United Nations and various organizations talking about loneliness being an epidemic. And there are so many people who just do not have personal connections.
Yeah.
And I've got this community that's ready built for me, that I can just walk in, and it's kind of like family in that they can't really say go away.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a place here no matter where here is.
Yeah.
And if I move to a new city, there's another place for me there.
Mm-hmm.
So I have this community of people that I can build relationships with.
Yeah.
And a third time when it really struck me that I'm not alone is a few years ago, my sister had a significant health issue. And she lives over in England.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed to go over there to provide some support, to do whatever I could, even though it was so very little.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard. And I spent almost all of my time in the hospital, and then walking back and forth. And some days I could barely walk to the place that I was sleeping that night. But around the corner, there was a church.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that no matter where I am in the world, I have a place that I can go to for support. And that Sunday, I went into the church and was just a faceless part of the congregation. And then afterwards, I went to coffee and I talked with some people, and I talked with the pastor. And no matter where I am not alone.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have people that I can lean on. It's just built into the system.
Yeah. And people like being helpful to each other. You know, I think, I also think about the loneliness epidemic and stuff that we've talked about, like that there is something nice about knowing you're needed, right? There's something nice about knowing, hey, I can be a friendly ear for this person who maybe I'll never see again. and like that brings meaning to all sorts of people, right? It's not just one way. I'm sure maybe they sort of felt like, oh, had a moment of connection there. Like that's a beautiful thing.
And one thing I've found is I've spent a lot of time standing on my own,
Mm-hmm.
And helping other people and supporting other people. And sometimes I have to pause and stop myself and say, the way that I can minister to this other person or give this other person a chance to have some meaning is to give them a chance to do something for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know that how much meaning that's brought to my life.
Yeah.
And it gives somebody else a chance to do some of that.
Yeah.
And I don't have to do it all on my own. And sometimes it's wrong for me to try to do it all on my own.
Yeah. I definitely resonate with that as someone who can sometimes be a bit of a one-man band. So have there been times in your life, you mentioned as a youth feeling kind of disconnected and that the truthiness or truthfulness of your faith wasn't what you needed it to be as a youth. Have there been other times in your life where you've met with a challenge, or your faith has been a challenge to you, or where your faith has helped you with a challenge? I mean, you just described, being in England, and that's certainly one. But
Well, every so often I think about my name. And my name is both an assertion of and a denial of my cultural background. Because my family in Denmark, where my parents come from, they call me Yen. Here in Canada, almost everybody calls me Jan,
right,
including my parents.
interesting.
Because they knew how it should be pronounced.
Yeah,
But they also knew that everybody I came across in Canada would mispronounce it. So they just decided to pronounce it the way everybody here would.
right.
So I was given a very ethnic name that's from a particular place in the world, and my parents chose to mispronounce it. And in the same sort of way, because as an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, you don't always know if you belong.
Yeah.
And along with my name, I've always felt, yes, I do belong. I'm part of this country. I'm part of whatever community I'm part of.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if I belong there.
Right.
So I've always held that kind of dual thing about, is this really my place? And I'm never quite sure. And then I came across, and I keep coming back to it, this idea of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Where no matter what, no matter who you are, no matter what you do, you are loved, you're accepted. And so all of that baggage that's represented by my name just drifts away. Because I don't have to worry about being accepted. I don't have to earn that. I get that right at the beginning. So all of that stuff is gone, and it's all just about looking forward. And that's a realization that I've come to, it's taken me decades, to make me feel comfortable in my own skin and comfortable just being.
That's a really lovely metaphor. I mean, it's not a metaphor, it's your life, but the name is a great metaphor for the thing you're describing. Yeah, like that sense of that duality of belonging, not belonging. I have a sense of ownership here, but also, do I really ever belong? And the idea that God being the sort of reminder that, of course, you belong. You will always belong. Yeah.
And having that feeling, I think, is a big part of why I got into teaching. Because I know that there are so many kids who feel that they don't belong. And I wanted to create a space where they could, that they felt, yeah, I've got home, that's where I live, and I've also got home here.
Yeah.
And the more we can create places where people feel that's their home, the better a world will be.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put, yeah. So I guess then my last question is always, is there something that you really want to talk about? We sort of talked early on about like, oh, we'll add in this stuff about the show, but is there something that you want to share?
There are a lot of judgments that people can make about people of other faith based on what they've seen in the media. And again, this brings me back to being Danish. Or rather, I'm not Danish, being of Danish background. And here, if you meet somebody and you say, hi, how are you? That means hi.
Yeah.
There, if you say, hi, how are you? And you're just moving on to just saying hi, it's seen as an insult.
Right.
Because what you're saying is, I don't care enough about you to get an answer. In Denmark, if you say, hi, how are you? What you're saying is, I've got 20 minutes so you can answer that question.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the 20 minutes, don't answer the question, or don't ask the question.
Right.
So similarly, if you've heard a Christian talking on the radio or on the TV, and they've said something objectionable about it, don't assume that you know something about me. Because you haven't sat down with me for 20 minutes and talked about what I believe. And it's so easy to make those assumptions about other people without talking to them. And the truth is that if you talk to somebody else in my congregation and you know them quite well, that doesn't mean you know something about me.
Right.
If you know one Lutheran Christian, you know one Lutheran Christian.
Yeah.
So don't assume that you know. Ask the question. Talk to the people around you. And there'll be so many things that will surprise you, and it will build so much depth into your relationships.
Yeah.
And it's when we act based on what we're assuming about other people that we make the world a more angry place.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And, that's sort of what we are trying to do here, is really have those conversations, really saying, hi, how are you? And meaning it. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, or maybe I should say for being on this end of the show. and it was really lovely talking to you. And thank you so much for joining us on Believe It or Not. We'll see you next time.
Okay.
That was fun. How do you feel?
Thanks. I don't know. We'll have to see. Did I remember everything I was thinking of saying?
Probably not, but that's okay. I thought you did great.
I wonder if I talked enough about the joy I get from my faith.